I'm going to talk about a systems approach to organizational design. And in fact, this will be a start of a series of talks. And what I want to first do is examine the playing field in which we exist and derive some principles and properties of this playing field and then apply it to different kinds of organizational situations. So as I said, this will be a series of talks. In talk one, we may just focus on some considerations as we want to think about redesigning the market economy. But in order to understand the playing field, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on a pattern of sustainable progress that exists at many different levels of our system. So this pattern is very well represented simply by the growth that a seed takes in becoming a flower. I'm going to represent this by three phases. So as we look at this, we see a seed. It gives rise to a shoot, and then there's a flower, which is the culmination of its journey. Now, when we consider the three phases in this journey, what we really see is that in phase one, which is represented by the seed, we have an entity that's isolated, that's distinct, that wants to maintain its status quo. And I'm going to refer to that phase as the physical phase. And then there's a second phase of growth, often very irrational, often assertive, aggressive growth. There's growth, of course, of something that we see, which is of a tendril structure of the shoot coming up above the ground, but also there's a lot of growth taking place with a root structure that penetrates the earth. And this may not be in a very cohesive or ordered way. The growth could take place in many different ways, but I just represent it simply by a stalk. And I will refer to this growth, which is irrational or assertive or aggressive or experimental, as the vital phase. And then there's a third phase, which is the culmination of that journey, when we have a flower emerging from this growth. And the flower represents what I call the mental phase. And here it's the purpose that was inherent in the seed now becomes apparent. Now, as we consider our playing field, this is of course at a micro level, but let's shift scales and look at something that's much more macro, and particularly in the movement that the earth makes around the sun. So I'm going to represent this at the other end of our playing field. We have the sun and we have the earth rotating around it, and the earth goes through rotation around its own axis. So there's a revolution around the sun, and then there's rotation on its own axis. And then on a daily basis, what happens is that there's again a repetition of this pattern that happens day after day after day for at least 4.5 billion years, or since the Earth-Sun system has been in existence. And in this pattern, there are again three distinct phases. So as the sun, relatively speaking, rises up above the horizon, then it's as though we become aware of everything that exists in its stationary form. So there's rocks, there's rivers, there's water, there's people, there's various kinds of objects, but these are all stationary, and it's as though they exist in this place of not wanting to change. And that's what happens first thing in the morning. But then as the sun goes across the sky and reaches its zenith, then all these different objects that were stationary to begin with now become a lot more active, and whatever they stood for in the scheme of things now gets fully represented. And so we have two stages. We have that physical stage in which things are maintaining their status quo without change, just being what they are. We have this vital phase as the sun reaches the zenith, and here there's a lot more experimentation, there's a lot more movement, there's assertiveness, there's aggressiveness, there's everything that represents what we call the vital phase. And then finally, as the sun begins to sink, relatively speaking, and you have a lot more stars that emerge across the night sky, then the very same situation can be observed almost from many different points of views, from many different suns, as it were. And we begin to develop this quality of introspection and observing the same thing from many different points of view. So this is much more of reasoning, much more of the mental aspect. So we see again this repetition of three phases that exist at the micro and macro level. But let's step down one level. And as we come to a level that, say, existed over this 4.5 billion years in which the Earth-Sun system has supposedly been in existence, then we see again three fairly distinct stages that have represented life across this 4.5 billion years. So to begin with, we had inanimate structures, maybe rocks, water, different elements that existed fairly isolated and distinct. And again, we can represent that as being a physical phase. That gave rise to a second phase in which there was a lot more assertiveness. So there's a growth of plants and simple animal life. There's assertiveness, there's experimentation, and again we see the rise of the vital phase. And then relatively recently we see reasoning beings that have now manifested on the earth, and this is represented by the mental phase. So again, as we look at the evolution of life itself over 4.5 billion years, we see three distinct phases that seem to have scanned its playing field. So as we step down from this level, we see the same pattern being repeated at another level. But let's step down, and here we're stepping down to something that we can grasp much more fully. And let's think about it in the development of economy, broadly speaking. So if we look at the last several hundred years, we'll see that the nature of economy has changed. So as we've moved from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy to a digital economy, and as we consider the meaning of this, or the essence of these three economies, what we really see is the agricultural economy is all about working with physical structures, using physical objects, creating physical output. So it can be represented by, again, the physical phase. When we think about the industrial age or the industrial economy, then really what's happening is that the number of flows are being heightened and accelerated. So we have flows of finance, flows of goods, flows of energy, flows of people in order to make this all work. So essentially there's a lot more aggressiveness, assertiveness, often irrationality. So again, we're relatively speaking going through a vital phase. And then much more recently, in the last couple of decades, what's happened is the economy has become has moved towards a digital economy, relatively speaking. And here it's much more the concept, the reason that is driving things. So it's, again, the mental phase. So we're seeing the same pattern repeating itself here. Now if we step down one more level and look at, say, corporations, you'll find that innovation in corporations can also be dictated by these three phases. So we may have an initial phase in which corporations are very materially focused, and meaning that they believe that their markets are fixed, their products are fixed, their services are fixed, the ways they do business are fixed. Everything is fixed. And in order to be successful within that fixed world, they have to do a fixed thing. Now, this has given rise to more of a financial focus in recent times, in which we're not constrained by fixed boundaries, fixed markets, fixed products, but it's something else that's animating the activity of business. And that animation is driven by this need to have financial success beyond anything else. And so in that kind of look at things, what's happening is that there's a lot more freedom to change markets, change products, change services, change the way business is done, so long as certain financial goals are met. So there's a lot more aggressiveness and assertiveness in this phase. And if you look at this, this is akin to the physical phase, this is akin to the vital phase.